movement globally. Today's discussion is about the climate emergency. It's entitled Building Socialism on a Warming Climate. And of course, any comrades who've been following the news will know that the climate emergency has been worrying all serious scientists for the last 30 years or so, with more and more evidence mounting of the increase in the pace of global warming and the involvement of human activity, particularly emissions, in those climatic changes. So we're really privileged this today. I was going to say this afternoon, but it's this morning for some. We were really privileged to have Matt Huber to talk to us. Matt is professor in the Department of Geography and Environmental Sciences at Syracuse University, and I think, Matt, you're going to talk for about well, how long would you like to talk for? 20 minutes or so, half an hour?
Yeah, probably 25 to 30 minutes, somewhere in there.
All right. I'll give you a kind of note at about 20 minutes so that you know how you're getting on. Okay, so
great.
It's over to Matt to introduce this topic.
All right, thanks so much, Ed. Thanks for inviting me. I'm excited to share this with you all. So, all right, so just going to give you a quick overview of the book. I think it's worth remembering, just a couple years ago, at least in the United States, there was a fair amount of optimism about the state of progress on the climate. But just a couple years later, it's clear things have gone horribly awry. Boom times have returned to the fossil fuel industry. In early 2022, oil and gas firms were reporting some of their best profits in decades. Just recently, ExxonMobil announced record profits. It's not just oil and gas, but coal, the dirtiest of fossil fuels, has seen its prices and profits surge. I would note that this is Peabody reporting triple than expected profits, and this is February 10th, before the invasion of Ukraine. Meanwhile, the Biden administration has pulled back on some of the most ambitious climate plans that they had and goals, and they consistently say that this is still a crisis that we can trust the private sector and the market to solve. That said, they have recently passed something called the Inflation Reduction Act, which in my view sort of doubles down on this idea that if we put sort of incentives out there, and the legislation is almost entirely tax credits, that we can just expect free market actors to do the right thing for the climate. And this means both consumers to buy things like electric vehicles and heat pumps, but also investors to invest in green energy by taking advantage of these incentives. So what can we make of this apparent impasse of fossil fuel production gone wild, alongside political inaction and cascading climate disaster? At its core, our problem can be boiled down to this: those that profit from the production of fossil fuels are going to continue to do so unless society can stop them. This is fundamentally a question of power. And in the book, I argue this power struggle is fundamentally a class issue, an issue of who owns and controls the means of production and to what end. So it's going to take a class struggle to solve. And in the book, I basically want to give you an overview of the book's structure, which focuses on three core classes at the core of climate politics today: the capitalist class, who's responsible for the crisis; the professional class, which is really driving climate policy advocacy and political activity; and the working class, which has both the power of numbers as the majority of society and the strategic capacity to shape the energy transition itself through labor and union organizing in the very sectors that we need to transform. So the core argument I'm trying to make is this: to take on the entrenched power of the first of these classes, the capitalists who control our energy system, we really need a mass movement that appeals to the vast majority of society itself in the working class. Ultimately, I argue we need to build a much more popular, majoritarian approach to climate politics. And I argue the professional class style of climate advocacy is particularly bad at this. So now I want to take a deeper dive into the idea of class and how it shapes our thinking on climate and inequality. The idea that climate change is a problem of inequality has attracted a lot of attention as of late. This report by Oxfam in 2015 called Extreme Carbon Inequality found that the bottom 50%, or sorry, the top 10% of people in the world are responsible for 50% of the emissions. Work by economist Thomas Piketty and others have shown similar results. There's this study that came out even more recently that locates a wealthy polluter elite who have these sort of excessive lifestyles. And in 2018, a widely cited study compared different lifestyle actions for their climate impact and found that the best decision you can make is to not have children. So I want to actually critique this style of thinking about climate change and inequality because it shares two fundamental assumptions. First, they assume class inequality is based purely on one's income or wealth, and above all, consumption and lifestyle practices. Second, more perniciously, they link emissions and carbon responsibility to these same consumption and lifestyle practices. And the linkage is based on a method of carbon footprint accounting, a metric that allows you to input your consumption practices, the cars you drive, the meat you eat, the children that you might have, into a calculator that can precisely determine how many pounds of carbon you emit per year. And the linkage of consumption-based footprints to emissions is so entrenched, it's rarely even questioned. You will find left-wing socialist publications who talk about climate change as a class problem, but only looking at this sort of consumption-based framework. Now, of course, I think you all know in this group that there's another way of thinking about class that does not focus primarily on your income or your consumption or lifestyle practices. A more traditional socialist understanding of class centers not on consumption at all, but on production. Class is defined by your relationship to the means of production. And that sounds old-fashioned to some, maybe, but the climate struggle, I would argue, is ultimately over this. It's about our industrial production system. It's not only how we produce energy, it's about how industrial producers are the most produce these inputs that go into every part of the economy. And also the industrial sector is the most responsible for emissions. One estimate suggests that just steel and cement production alone are responsible for about 15 to 20% of global carbon emissions. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change also found that really it's the industrial sector that's responsible for the most emissions of all sectors. I would add that one of these categories of agricultural, forestry, and other land use is a huge source, but that's also forms of production, whether it be forestry or agricultural production that are transforming landscapes in particular ways. Now, we should understand that under capitalism, production is shaped by a fundamentally different logic. Ownership of capital seeking profit, people investing money with the hopes of making returns. Consumption is entirely different. We use money to provision our needs by going into the market and getting commodities. And so however extravagant those needs are, the logic of consumption is fundamentally different. And when we shift our class analytic to this lens to focus on production, ownership, profit, we come to fundamentally different conclusions when it comes to climate responsibility. The first point we might want to point out is that the idea of a carbon footprint itself was concocted by the very industry profiting off of fossil fuels in the first place. This recent study reports that the very notion of a personal carbon footprint was first popularized in 2004 by British Petroleum as part of their Beyond Petroleum campaign, which we're still waiting for them to do so. And they spilled a lot of petroleum into the Gulf of Mexico here in the United States. The second, and the British Petroleum is very happy to have this narrative that all of us have these individualized carbon footprints, and it takes a lot of the attention off them as the core profiteers of this climate crisis. Second, we should understand that every carbon footprint is not an isolated individual, but a web of social relations that's wrapped up in production. When you drive a car and emit carbon, the gasoline or petrol in your tank flowed through the hands of innumerable people seeking profit off that exchange. Oil exploration consultants, rig service firms, gas station, pipeline companies, yet you are the one responsible for the footprint solely because you're at the end of that commodity chain. The third point is that when we focus only on an individual rich person's lifestyle, we ignore how they became rich in the first place. In other words, if we only focus on how rich people spend their money, we don't focus on how they generate and make their money. And as it happens, that activity of making money might have much more significant climate impact. So you could take this guy, a CEO of a chemical company, and this person spends 8 to 12 hours per day helping to organize a global network of chemical factories that emit millions of tons of carbon dioxide per year. And as CEO, their income, their stock options are primarily derived from this activity, planning and expanding chemical production as a commodity for sale. Now, we could imagine that this guy is a vegetarian and takes public transit and has a low carbon footprint, but no one would argue that this person is a major driver of climate breakdown by their money-making activities. And even, if they were to eat a lot of steak and drive an SUV, that would be a drop in the bucket compared to their everyday role as a titan of chemical capital. So again, I'm arguing that the main culprits of the climate crisis are not simply rich, affluent consumers, rather it's a class of people who profit from the production of aviation, automobiles, steel, chemicals, and other carbon-intensive forms of capital. And I think this actually clarifies our political task. Rather than a moral project to convert the lifestyles of billions of dispersed consumers, we face a perhaps harder but more straightforward political project to erode the power of a class who controls and profits from production. And again, it's sort of in classic socialist political language, it's really a minority of society that really controls our energy system and has decision-making power over it. And it's really the vast majority of us that lack that power and control. And it's that kind of, struggle of the many against the few that I think is somewhat absent in some of this climate discourse. So that's the first argument about the capitalist class. The second focuses on the class, or stratum, if you like, who drives climate politics itself, the professional class. This class is made up of credentialed degree holders like journalists, scientists, academics, non-governmental organization staffers. These are the people at the core of climate advocacy. And this class also happens to be the class most invested in this kind of moral politics of lifestyle choices, by the way. I should say that I proposed this book in 2017, and since then there's been a just very polarizing debate, particularly in the United States, over this concept of the professional managerial class. I want to make clear there's no inherent problem with professional class people doing environmental politics or socialist politics. All powerful left-wing and socialist movements have had these layers of intellectuals, of professional revolutionaries. But if professional class politics is antagonistic to the majority of working people in the society, that's the problem I'm trying to identify. So what is the professional class? I want to make 3 crucial points. First, the material project of the professional class is about marshaling credentials, things like degrees and licenses, to carve out advantages in the labor market. Materially, this means the professional class project is ultimately toward gaining some semblance of middle class economic security. Second, and perhaps most crucially, the professional class is minority of the population. This is the United States, but I think it's pretty similar to European countries in the UK. This analysis from Ken Moody shows it's about 22% of the workforce. In the United States, about 63% of Americans lack a college degree. So this kind of wedge that some people have identified as educational polarization has real it actually has real political impacts, not just on the climate. Third, thinking about our definition of class as related to production, the professional class is profoundly separated from material production and largely confined to what is often referred to as the knowledge economy. And in fact, the rise of the professional class and the dramatic expansion of higher education has paralleled the decline of the industrial working class, particularly in the global north. Consequently, the professional class tends to view industrial production as purely a source of harm and environmental destruction, and not as a system that the working class has to seize and transform to provision for more social and ecological needs, as socialists would more traditionally put it. On this basis, we can identify a couple basic approaches to professional class climate politics. First, it's deeply invested in a politics of knowledge, a politics of belief or denial in the science. These are images from something that happened in the United States during the Trump years called the March for Science, which was a very sort of mass action of the professional class, you could put it. The second point is because of their relative material comfort and separation from production, professional class environmental politics is often rooted in an anxiety around their own consumption, or what one of the chapters of the book is called carbon guilt. At the core of professional class politics is a contradiction. It's based upon using credentials to attain economic security, but the forms of consumption attached to that security, things like single-family home ownership, car ownership, professional expectations of flight travel, create tremendous feelings of ecological complicity while the world burns. This leads to the idea that they themselves are the core drivers of climate change and not the owners of capital, as detailed in the previous section. Rather than focus on those with the real power, professionals tend to blame themselves. And this woman actually said this on a podcast, that she is part of the polluter elite. She's also one of the authors of this study that says the best thing to do to solve climate change is not have children. So in the book, I categorize 3 core types of professional class climate activists. And I try to espouse how each of these types espouses a climate politics that's, again, pretty antagonistic to the rise of sort of the majority of working people. The first are the science communicators, who are either natural scientists themselves or otherwise deeply invested in kind of knowing what the science has to say, like environmental journalists. These types of people believe the primary problem in environmental politics is a lack of awareness or outright denial of the knowledge. And if they believe if the masses truly understood the knowledge of or the science of climate, action would inevitably follow. Now, it should be obvious that this kind of politics doesn't really speak directly to the material concerns of the masses of working people, even if I would argue the masses of working people really do understand this science. It's not that complicated. The second is what I call the policy technocrat, who's probably going to have more expertise in law or policy studies, work in think tanks or academia, or professionalized NGOs. These types of people seek to design smart policy solutions and use logic and rational policy design to sway politicians and the public towards their solutions. And for the last several decades, these technocrats have been convinced that they can design free market policies like carbon pricing schemes. And I profile this organization trying to pass something called a carbon fee and dividend. And I found that their slogan, or one of their many slogans, is that we're going to outsmart climate change, which to me kind of epitomizes this professional class approach to being very smart and using smarts to fight climate change. And you can see how masses of working people respond to these kinds of market-based policies. In a very liberal and environmentally friendly state of Washington, carbon tax referendums failed by large margins in both 2016 and 2018. And of course, closer to you all, you remember how working people reacted to a pretty regressive fuel tax, carbon tax put in by Macron. The Yellow Vest movement had this kind of slogan that politicians are so concerned with the end of the world, yet we are concerned with the end of the month. And it's been a real failure of the climate left to really reach people on these end of month types of issues. Consequently, workers are increasingly receptive to the right-wing view that environmental policy is meant to harm their economic lives. And if anyone mobilizes class politics in the climate fight, it's the right who consistently cites the economic consequences of climate policy. So this is someone named Charles Koch, this sort of baron of oil capital, who here is claiming that he's the one that's very concerned about climate policy hurting the poor. So he's able to position himself as a friend of the poor. Finally, there's the what I call the anti-system radicals, whose own exposure to the science of collapse has led to a kind of political radicalization. But again, their professional class location creates a context of relative material and economic security, which tends them to focus more on the need to lessen consumption and focus on what I call in the book a politics of less. So the most popular form of this politics is what is referred to as the degrowth movement, which in this profile, one of their slogans could be how to live better with less. And, basically, the main argument I'm trying to make is that, this kind of politics of the need to degrow or lessen consumption really appeals quite narrowly to this sort of professional middle class context. But for a wider working class majority who's been living with less and austerity and wage stagnation and debt and attacks on their living standards, this doesn't really have the capacity to win over. And I would argue for a more sort of class struggle framing that says, not that we need to degrow in general, but that we need to degrow the capitalist class and degrow capital so that we can grow all these really important things for the working class, like like more secure access to the basics of life, but also things like green energy and public transit.
Matt, you've had about 20 minutes.
Okay, yeah, that should work pretty well. Moving right along.
Thanks.
I think it's worth mentioning that none of these have really been able to solve the climate crisis. So we need a massive shift in strategy if we're going to be able to build a movement that has the power to take on some of the wealthiest corporations in world history. So that's where the third class comes in, the working class. And again, a lot of this is largely a democratic argument. The working class represents the vast majority of society. It's not just an electoral argument, though. It's sort of drawing on a tradition, a really left-wing and socialist analysis that says that you don't win unless you have the masses on your side. So there's been a very influential pamphlet by a socialist named Peter Kamehu, who differentiates between kind of liberalism, ultra-leftism, and mass action, and says really powerful winning socialist movements have to take this kind of mass action approach. Put it another way, Lenin actually argued that politics only wins where the masses are, not in thousands of people, but millions of people. So this sort of mass action approach is what I'm arguing for. Now, the first step towards a working class climate politics is finding a way to counter this right-wing narrative that climate action is not in the interest of the working class. So the question I raise is, if the working class has material interests, can we frame these as ecological or climate interests? And I argue answering this requires going back to a basic Marxist definition of the working class, or the proletariat, which is a class fundamentally separated from the means of production, a class that really is separated from the land, first and foremost, therefore separated and alienated from the ecological conditions of life itself, or what you may say the means of subsistence, and that this separation creates this fundamental proletarian insecurity in accessing the very nature of the things you need in life itself, because you're dependent on the market to get these things. And this is what I call proletarian ecology, this kind of insecure need to survive via the market. Now, it should be clear that the working class has a material interest in more secure access to the basics of life. And I would argue it's very convenient that basic working class needs, things like housing, energy, transportation, and food, these are precisely the sectors that we need to aggressively decarbonize. So if we were to have a decarbonization program that pairs climate planning and decarbonization alongside cheaper or even free access to these basics of life, we might be able to construct a more working class climate program. And again, this type of climate action would have nothing to do with material sacrifice or having, it wouldn't have to be about knowing the science of the climate crisis. It would just appeal to these obvious working class needs. And I think the sort of Green New Deal, as articulated by Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, but also Jeremy Corbyn, this was an attempt, a first draft, if you will, to try to construct this kind of working class climate program. And I would also add that it really draws, it's called a New Deal for a good reason. It draws on this New Deal tradition, which was in many ways an energy expansion policy of building out a lot of hydroelectric energy and delivering that energy to masses of poor people. The Tennessee Valley Authority had this slogan of electricity for all. Now, the problem with the theory of change in the Green New Deal is that you actually have to deliver material gains under the banner of climate action for this to actually work. And that's what I think we're lacking the power to kind of deliver this kind of program. And the problem with much of this kind of insurgent left politics, even if it's class politics like the Bernie Sanders campaign, is that the working class might agree with your program, but the main barrier to winning their support is they don't believe that you can actually pull off things like, in our country, Medicare for all or a Green New Deal. As Vivek Chibber has recently argued, workers are more prone towards resignation, this feeling that things are bad, but there's nothing we can do about it. So in many ways, the Green New Deal and the Bernie Sanders movement put the cart before the horse. They thought this kind of electoral program would awaken the sleeping giant of the working class from decades of atomization and defeat. But history, like the 1930s, shows it's typically working class organization that comes first in the form of things like trade unions and political parties and things that really can deliver things in people's lives on the ground that start to build up confidence, and that collective action can actually deliver the goods if people join a kind of working class movement. So that brings to the next key question of a working class strategy for climate. What should the role of unions be? How can workers use their strategic power at the point of production to affect change on this issue? Now, the environmental movement, that often there's a lot of consternation about the negative role that the labor movement and unions play in resisting the decarbonization agenda. The unions tend to prioritize good unionized jobs, no matter what the ecological consequences. But I would argue it's not as if neoliberal austerity offers much in the way of a safety net to workers when coal mines shut down or when power plants shut down. So again, it's this kind of proletarian insecurity that causes workers and unions to choose jobs over the environment every time, because it's the thing that gives them basic survival under capitalism. So the standard left response is that we need something called a just transition, the idea that displaced workers in dirty industries should be given support to transition into a clean energy economy. The problem is, though, that much of the fossil fuel workforce has never heard of anything called a just transition, and communities hollowed out by coal mine or power plant closures don't believe anything like a just transition exists. They just see economic devastation and unemployment. So in the book, I suggest we should not forget that the idea of a just transition came from a legendary union and environmental activist named Tony Mazzocchi. Mazzocchi modeled his idea of a just transition on a policy that he himself benefited from, kind of the last hurrah of the New Deal. It was called the GI Bill. In over nearly 3 decades, the GI Bill actually allowed 13 million former soldiers or veterans to transition from a war economy to the civilian economy. So rather than sloganeering, a real just transition would need to be this kind of massive public sector expansion that could actually convince workers that there really is something for them if we shut down these industries like fossil fuels. But just transition politics also has a pretty limited vision of what the working class can achieve. It sort of positions workers as victims in need of support. But a real working class strategy to win climate action has to position workers and unions as powerful agents of transformation itself. So a union-based climate strategy should recognize that there's certain sectors of the economy that are more strategic to organize in than others. And the labor activist Jane McAlevey has argued that in the 1930s, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, much of it led by communists and socialists, they really decided it made sense to strategically focus on certain industries like steel and coal and automobiles. And today she suggested that the strategic sectors we should focus on are healthcare and education and logistics. But I think we can think differently about climate change and recognize that it's clear that any rational pathway to 100% decarbonization goes through one sector of the economy. It's the electric utility sector. So there's something, basically the basic strategy to decarbonize our economy starts with cleaning up the electric sector and then electrifying parts of our economy that don't run on electricity, like heating or transportation and industrial heat. But few Green New Deal activists have pointed out that the electric utility sector is already one of the most unionized in the entire economy. It's in the US got about 25% union density, which is really high. So the argument I make is that socialists and other radical climate activists need to really engage with these unions at the heart of the very energy sector that we need to transform, and win these unions to our side to really affect change over this system. And another thing worth pointing out is that in the renewable energy sector is actually, like solar and wind, is actually quite, at least in the United States, quite anti-union. And it's run almost entirely by for-profit private capital. A lot of it's owned by really wealthy investors on Wall Street. So climate activists should argue and make a pitch to these unions that if they aren't really thinking strategically and mounting a long-term strategy to position themselves at the heart of this green transition, they risk being destroyed by this kind of Wall Street-led green renewable capitalism. So it would be in their interest to really organize around climate transition. So in conclusion, there's one last motto of traditional working class politics we should talk about, which is internationalism. Of course, this is the lyrics, the British lyrics to the Internationale, where they talk about Internationale unites the human race. Now, in the face of the prospect of human extinction and planetary ruin, we need a new kind of ecological internationalism that's not only about emancipating and uniting the human race, but saving humanity from this kind of ecological crisis. But while ecological politics often points to reuniting local communities with local ecologies, returning to the land, a proletarian ecological internationalism would have to be planetary in scope. And again, I think Marx and others believe that the fact that the working class or the proletariat was itself torn from the land and torn from like direct local or parochial concerns, that's what made it into this kind of universal class that had the potential to be the class that ended all classes and had the potential to unite and emancipate humanity as a whole. And I think we could actually assert a wider human interest in energy itself. In particular, we should recognize what organizers have been organizing around, that we should really organize around something basic like electricity as a human right that could be paired with decarbonization, right? But we don't point out enough that around the world, internationally, there's incredible amounts of what are called energy poverty. About 700 to 800 million people on the planet have zero electricity access, but the amount with limited electricity access is even more stunning. The energy analyst Robert Bryce did some calculations to reveal that his refrigerator, which consumes about 1,000 kilowatt hours per year, consumes more than the annual consumption of about 3.3 billion people on the planet. So nearly half the planet consumes less electricity than your refrigerator, or at least this guy's refrigerator in Texas. So that brings to another socialist icon, which is Lenin, whose revolutionary project took place in a rural country where many lacked access to the basic amenities of modern industrial life. And of course, he famously said that communism is Soviet or worker power plus electrification of the whole country. So I actually think we can resurrect this kind of vision of working class emancipation through decarbonized energy systems and through really generalizing electricity as a human right. And this kind of more positive climate politics could help us stave off climate disaster itself. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Matt. That's a really interesting introduction, packed full of information and a brilliant set of slides to go with it. I'm sure there are a lot of comrades who want to respond to that. Matt, if it's all right with you, the normal way that WIN conducts these discussions is that everyone's allowed to say things. If you could make notes and maybe come back sometime later in the meeting, perhaps even at the end if lots of people want, but I'll give you plenty of time to respond to all the points that are made. It creates discussion rather than a question and answer session.
Yeah, sounds great.
Thank you, Matt. Ian already has his hand up. So Ian, it's over to you. Can you unmute yourself, please, Ian? Unmute yourself. That's it. Okay.
Sorry. Yeah, thank you, and thanks to Matt for what I thought was an absolutely excellent contribution. Maybe the best that I've heard on this subject. I think it's good that when I think in the last few weeks put up these meetings within a few hours of being recorded, and I'll definitely be trying to spread this one far and wide, because I think there's so much clarity in it that often gets lost from the debate for some of the class reasons you were getting into. What I'd like to raise first is just the question of timings or tempos or time scales that this raises, because going back a bit, when Marx first theorized socialism and communism, it was at the very start of industrial capitalism, and looking back, it was always probably going to be very unlikely that shortly after 1848 the capitalist system would be superseded, given the normal kind of dialectical coming into being and then being superseded that all previous societies had gone through. So he was very prescient at that time, and it wasn't a particular failure of the movement that it didn't immediately take power in the 19th century. And after that first period of really intense, horrible exploitation of the dark satanic mills, that capitalism even began to stabilize itself in various ways, the most important and damaging of which, of course, was imperialism, which then led to a world war where the weakest link in the chain was actually a new working class in a rural country. And then it got, once it had taken power, it got encircled by the rest of the world. And meanwhile, social democracy collapsed into supporting the war. And we had the caricature of socialism latterly and under Stalinism that was then used as a scarecrow against any kind of socialism in the West. And 70 or 80 years of distortions that nobody really in 1848 could have foreseen. But the idea all of that time was that we can get past these temporary things and get back to the class struggle, and at some further point move ahead for socialism, even dealing with new challenges like the threat of fascist tyranny along the way. But now this particular threat of climate change, like before it, the nuclear bomb, poses the existential threat, not just socialism or barbarism, but socialism or extinction. Perhaps with barbarism now as the mushy moderate middle between socialism and extinction, because some of the capitalist ways of dealing with the climate left to their own devices and putting the entire burden of that onto working people could themselves be quite barbaric and authoritarian, and then that makes them also perhaps even less likely to get through than the socialist ways if they're actually popularized in the way that Matt's doing today. So not only is barbarism, being a moderate, mushy middle, quite a depressing idea in its own right, but it's also means that barbarism is unlikely because it's a moderate, mushy middle, that if we don't move forward to socialism, perhaps it is more likely than not that we'll go backwards towards something even worse than barbarism. But we're doing talking about all this at a period post the seeming failure of revolution and socialism in the previous century, long kind of hangover from that, where things have been going in the last 30 odd years at a historically slow tempo. So you look at Syriza getting in there, one tactic to solve the Greek debt crisis was to ask nicely. When Merkel said no, they ended up accepting a worse deal than the one they were fighting against initially. It's not just about socialism. In Egypt, they had a revolution for democracy, and even that proved too extreme a thing to advance towards, and instead they fell back to something worse than they had even under Mubarak. And I was banned from Egypt by Mubarak, so I'm not defending him, but Sisi has turned out to be a lot worse. And so that was just a revolution for normal procedural democracy. didn't even work. In our own country, we've seen the very modest approach of Corbyn, most disastrously on the witch hunt, prioritising unity with the playwrights, to denying their lies that he was an anti-Semite, and then collapsing into Starmerism, which has been worse for the left in the Labour Party than Blair was. We've also seen some debates just going on and on in the hamster wheel, whether it's Brexit that was voted for but went on for 3.5 years after that and pushed everything else more important out of politics, whether it's Scottish independence that's still a hamster wheel in Scottish politics 8 years after we voted not to go down that route, whether it's in the United States, Trump in or out of office seems to be an obsession not only of his own side but also of the other side, which leads to the much more hopeful Sanders movement often folding behind rogues like Biden, even on issues as serious as this war. We see a culture war where on the right, they're often quite prescient and correctly worried about the immediate and instantaneous threat of a nuclear war with Russia, but completely blasé and willfully blind to the question we're discussing tonight. Whereas on the so-called left, really the extreme centre in the United States, I think Matt called it the centre-right party called the Democrats, or that might have been on my previous webinar, I can't remember now, but it's certainly true, that they're actually recognise at least that this is a real challenge, but are willfully blind to the dangers of starting a war with Russia, and it all becomes about cultural signifiers rather than a policy you'd think that could be against both threats to human life, and that is policy
Ian,
left and socialism. And that's
Ian, can you wind up soon,
that's sort of
please?
where I'm winding up, how to get out of this culture war and this period of very slow, often repetitive debates, often between bad and worse, or two forms of bourgeois politics, and to rise to the occasion after this period where we had the feeling that the slower the better, the slower the more democratic and peaceful, whereas now we're under this much more intense tempo, almost like the urgency of ending the First World War 100 years ago, but this time with regards to the fate of the whole planet, and doing it in a way that doesn't put it on the backs of working people, which would be both crueler and actually less likely to succeed. All right, thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ian. Okay, thanks very much. The next speaker I'm going to call is John. Please come in, John. John, you're still muted. Can you unmute?
There's going to be one day I'm going to not do that. Yeah, I had a question about the whole concept of the mass action that is going to be required. Clearly, there's going to have to be an effort made in the short term to stay the hand of the capitalist class with regards to demands around decarbonisation, transition and such like. But it seems to me there's another side to the question, which is the impacts of climate change, which are becoming more and more of a reality. I mean, in Pakistan, it's playing out as an absolute horror, but everywhere we're seeing floods, wildfires, droughts, I mean, enormous impacts. And it's obvious that those play out along lines of class inequality, racial inequality, and global inequality. So I'd like, if you could, just to address the way in which the movement can and must be organized to fight back on that front.
Thank you very much, John. Nice, concise question. I'm going to Matthew now.
Yeah, thanks, Corey. Very useful introduction. I think the one thing that there are a lot of things in that. I don't really agree with the comrades' analysis of class, but on a different base, I think the other thing it really is about electricity. I think he's right in terms of saying, well, the significant question will be electricity, in terms of development of electricity. Having worked in the sector for more than 20 years, what you can see is, of course, that the key question then becomes the control of electricity. Now, electricity is perfectly possible for people to control on a relatively local basis. I mean, you could actually run the network in most countries on a basis of a few streets at a time. You could have democratic control of the system. Of course, they won't want that. And it's become ever more remote. And actually, what we get into at the moment, of course, is a position under the conditions of war in Ukraine. Of course, is that even basic utilities are now becoming unaffordable. For a large section of the population, actually under threat this winter of being cut off from access to electricity and in some cases gas as well. Such that the bizarrities of the capitalist system. The other thing, of course, it comes to is becomes a question of technology as well, because I mean, obviously, you start to look at other forms of technology and access to those, and you look at sort of the questions of electric batteries become increasingly important in terms of the regulation of the system. Interesting enough, of course, if you have large amounts of renewables on the system, what it does is make the system unstable, as opposed to a few large coal power stations in which the system can be regulated quite simply. Now, of course, it becomes much more complicated, and actually what you need is large chunks of batteries in order to stabilize the system properly. And the problem then becomes, what form of those batteries? At the moment, the current sort of solution appears to be mostly lithium. And the question, of course, then becomes, well, where does the lithium come from? And you're now getting movements of people saying, well, you're not mining lithium near me. And we're also getting a position in which, as we've seen, the coup, there was the recent coup in Bolivia, which of course was sponsored by one Elon Musk, of course, because he was very interested in the fact that there is a lot of lithium in Bolivia, and therefore he, as he said, we'll coup who we like, in order to obtain access to these things. So then it becomes again a question of control. You also get the position, now get the position in technology terms, of course, is the control of rare earth elements, or what's called rare earth elements. They're not actually that rare, but they are quite difficult to extract, and these, of course, are largely these days extracted by the Chinese, but form an essential part of motors for both electric vehicles and such like, and electric motors in general of any size, and also, of course, wind turbines. So the whole technology then becomes it's a question of control. So the US is now going to start fighting over control of rare earth. So we get all these things all thrown in there. In terms of the imperialist system, and I think also what he's saying, okay, well, the problem with the whole sort of Green New Deal thing is just to look at the working class as being subject to this, rather than saying, well, the working class actually has to be making its own demands and running the whole, looking to how it can run the whole damn system anyway, rather than saying, well, okay, well, we're going to put a whole lot of people in the oil industry at work and the rest of it, what we're going to do with them. And the question should be, well, how can we go to the workers that are currently in the industry and say, well, how should we put this? How should we put this together? And how do we make that transition? Because obviously, as we know, the working class is, at least in potential, the most powerful social force in world history. And the question is how to make it that, and what demands do we put, and how do we get around, as you see, I mean, you can see the conditions of the trade unions, of course, I mean, are pretty awful generally. I mean, their whole sort of adoption of this or understanding of this is pretty terrible. I mean, varying from the truly awful, like some of the American unions and the likes of the GMB in this country, to the sort of vaguely, Green New Deal. But nobody's actually gotten to the point of saying, well, here we want a program that actually, is a working class program to change the nature of this, of the society and of this sector, and the potential, the potential to do things differently, as opposed to these sort of monolith, what we've got at the moment, which is, of course, a whole series of monolithic utilities, all controlled by large capital, usually fairly remotely, actually, as I say, you could actually run these things on a very local level, and you could run them democratically without any real problem. The technology exists to do that, and we should be looking to say, well, this is how we should do it. Okay,
Matt, you've had 5 minutes.
Yeah, no problems.
Oh, okay. Finn.
Hey, comrades, I want to begin by thanking Matt for a very clear, very informative opening contribution. And I'd recommend that all the comrades would read his book, Climate Change as Class War, because it's the most forceful presentation of a Marxist perspective on the climate that I've ever seen. And most of the discourse on climate, as Matt explains in his book, is all around knowledge. As though simply knowledge about climate itself will achieve the changes that are necessary. And he contrasts that approach to an activist's role within the trade union movement. And he asks, and rightly so, that people become involved and active in their trade unions, not lecturing about climate change to workers, but becoming active in the real workers' struggles themselves, such as health and safety and working conditions. And arising from gaining a position of respect in the workplace, you then raise issues such as the environment and climate. And he also, which I think is extremely important, links the climate issues to real issues that affect working people: housing, transport, electricity, and they are all linked. And something which I didn't know about was the Tennessee Valley project, which was a public project set up during the New Deal period and got in local communities and trade unions involved. Now, it was under the New Deal arrangement, but it's an example of what can be achieved. He gives particular emphasis to electrical workers and also in the contribution tonight, because they're at the core of power generation. And when electrical workers, which are very highly unionized, I learned in America in a comparative sense, when they become involved actively and consistently in the climate issues, then everything changes. Everything changes. And we need to bear that in mind. And of course, the same applies to all trade union activity. It has to link the issues of the real living struggles in housing, environment, housing and transport. And he mentions electricity as a human right, which we don't often hear about. Of course, it's a human right. So much of human life depends on the availability of electricity. And this then is contrasted to the knowledge approach. And it's important to realize as well that even though the youth are very involved in climate change, the real power, in opposing climate change, the real power to achieve goals in that regard is not through the youth movement per se, but through trade union activity. And while the knowledge is always useful and important, and we must never decry knowledge, it's important to know where the real power in society lies. And the same for personal consumption. Instead of people going around feeling guilty about flying on planes and eating meat, the real power rests with the capitalist class and the people who have control over production. So the ownership of production is the key issue and the key question: who controls the production? That's what we need to look at. Now, I have two questions which I want to ask Matt. First of all, some of the heaviest producers of carbon dioxide are steel, concrete, fertilizer. But I asked this question as a chemist. In order to produce cement and concrete, you release CO2. Now, if there are alternatives, I'd like Matt to maybe tell us a bit about that, because it's not just the burning of fossil fuels to generate commodities. The very creation of the essential concrete, which is necessary for roads, houses, bridges, all hospitals, all the building relies on concrete. And concrete production itself, irrespective of the provision of electricity or power in the plant, the production of concrete itself releases CO2. Now, is there an alternative material that can be used there, and how might we approach it? And the same question applies in the production of fertilizers, where nitrogen can be fixed by the Haber process, which was 100 years old now, but it's still necessary to get hydrogen. And the production of hydrogen in the ordinary way itself releases carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So are there alternatives? And of course, the same applies to every metal and steel. In the reduction of metals from their oxides, which are the ores, carbon dioxide is produced, sometimes carbon monoxide, which changes, of course, to carbon dioxide rapidly. So if there are alternatives, I'd be very interested to hear how we might approach that question, particularly in the areas where carbon dioxide seems to be part of the production process itself, irrespective of the energy in the plant. And one final question, which arises really from the book. Matt talks a lot in his book about the democratic sources of America and the role, it's a limited role, but nonetheless the role that they play. And I'd like maybe if you give us some detail, like what do you think is the potential for socialist advance or education or propaganda, or whatever? What potential does the democratic source of America have really in the development of socialism in America, well, in worse case, but in America principally? And in that regard also, you made a lot of references in your book to Sanders' campaign and the failures of the campaign. But I'm interested in what the potential is for socialist advance in the democratic sources of America and in the residue, which it is now, of Sanders' campaign when he stood twice and achieved very, very well for president in America. Thanks, comrades, and thank you, Matt.
Okay, thank you, Finn. I'm going over to Rob now. Rob?
Okay.
Yep, got you.
Thank
Thank you.
Yeah, I think Matt has provided an excellent exposition of a socialist approach to climate change. But I want to put forward two kind of provocative propositions. The first is that capitalism has proved to be extremely resilient. We can look at the experience of the past 100 years or more. Capitalism has weathered many crises, world wars, slumps, depressions. And my proposition is that capitalism will be forced to deal with the climate crisis. The crisis won't bring capitalism down. There are potential so-called solutions, geotechnical solutions, using chemicals or other means to alter the climate, and who knows what the results could be with that. So I think socialists have to look at the possibility that the crisis will cause a barbaric political and economic solutions, because if it's left up to the capitalists, those are the only kind of solutions that they would be able to find. And my second proposition is that the climate crisis won't wait for a socialist revolution. We cannot say, okay, this is the issue, this is how we've got to organize, and over the next 50 years, we have to build a movement that can kind of do A, B, or C. We will have to deal, or our successors will have to deal with a capitalism that is racked with chronic and acute crisis, with various groups putting forward solutions, but and class struggle will in a way be seen as almost secondary to the need to find a solution to the climate crisis. It won't mean that the poor aren't the worst hit, that the devastation will not be absolutely immense and unthinkable for the world's poor, but this is the kind of world we're likely to see in the next few decades. Thanks.
Right, thank you very much, Rob. Thank you to all those questions, the comrades who've asked questions. I'm tempted to ask a question, but at the moment, Matt has got quite a lot to respond to. So before I abuse my position as the chair, I'm going to ask Matt to come back and maybe respond to some of that, and hopefully there'll be more time for further discussion afterwards. Is that okay with you, Matt? Okay,
Sure.
over to you. Over to you.
All right. Thanks so much for these very helpful questions and comments. Ian, I don't have a lot to respond. I just agree with a lot of what you were saying, in the way in which you rightly position this as a kind of revival of that classic Rosa Luxemburg socialism or barbarism calculus, I think is right on. One of the things the book is trying to do is really just, I don't think climate change is often thought of as a class struggle. And in fact, we can think of a sort of multi-decade period in which environmental politics itself has been positioned as a non-class based movement. There's been this there was this shift in the 1960s where we had something called new social movements that were supposedly quite different from socialist and class-based movements of the past. But what I'm trying to just establish is that even if we don't call it a class-based movement, it is that fundamentally that a struggle over material industrial production systems is in fact has to be a class struggle. And what's as Fen was pointing out, what's really weird is how something that is so material, it's not just about industrial production, but it's about the material conditions of survival and like the biogeochemical nature of the atmosphere. Something incredibly, you couldn't get more material than that, has been turned into an almost idealist struggle over knowledge and over science, right? And so part of the book is trying to, we got to understand the type of struggle we're in, and it is a class struggle, and we have to build the kind of power that can confront those who currently control this energy system for one goal in mind, which is profit. And again, after I finished the book, 2022 has really hammered that home, as fossil fuel companies have just been delivered windfall profits in the wake of the Russian invasion and all these other social forces out of the pandemic. It just seems we're just still so willing to allow these companies to make all this money on buying or sort of selling the fuel that everyone knows, because of the science or knowledge, is heating up and destroying the conditions for human survival. It's pretty insane. So John brings up something that accurately, I should say, I don't spend a lot of time talking about, which is the uneven and particularly class and also racial and geographical uneven impacts of climate change that are now just very much here with us, and we're seeing this all across the board. I know I think in the UK, where many of you has dealt with heat waves in the last summer, and that can have really unequal effects on the poorest people that don't have access to air conditioning and things like this. And it's actually very deadly. And then you go to the global level and you see what happened in Pakistan and just the other devastation that's happening. So one thing I will say is that the climate movement has often pointed out this issue of, and it's often seen as the heart of what is often referred to as climate justice, which is that those that have contributed least to the problem are bearing the worst effects. And that's absolutely true. One point I want to make is that at least, again, it's not true in Pakistan, that's for sure, but in the United States, there's still not, I think, a mass majority of people that are experiencing the worst effects from climate change to create a mass basis politically where your politics is really, if it's all going to be about these, sometimes they're called frontline communities that are hit worst and hit this constituency is just not, it's very marginalized groups of society that are some of the most poor and oppressed groups, and therefore we can't sort of assume that this is going to be the constituency or basis for a mass action political movement. And so we have to find a way to kind of reach people on a more, not just simply on the fact they may have been impacted by climate change, but that more on the things that I think is more a everyday disaster for working people, which is just capitalism itself, trying to survive in the market, trying to pay those end of month struggles are really disastrous for people, and people are making heartbreaking decisions about whether or not to pay their heating bill or their rent or childcare and these types of things. And we have to be able to ground climate politics in those more things that impact people every day, as opposed to floods and storms that do impact people and they have horrible uneven effects, but it's more it's sort of margins. And I brought up this stat, there's Yale University does these opinion maps about climate change, and they have a series of questions. Let me see if I can actually put the link in the chat. And you can find there's an estimate for what percentage of Americans thinks climate change will impact them personally. And that percentage is 47%. So there's literally a majority of people in the US that even if they think climate change is real, they don't even think it's going to harm them. So again, I think if we're going to ground our politics in the impacts, it's going to be harder to build that kind of mass politics approach. Matthew brought up a lot of really important points. Fundamentally, I think the key, again, from a socialist perspective, a key issue is control and control over production. And we need to really think about a movement that could assert control over, and as he brings up, our electricity system. And as Finn also brought up, one thing that inspired me was looking back to these movements for public power and public ownership of electricity, which were, at least in the US context, were really reacting to this incredibly predatory and monopolistic profiteering form of control over electricity, which was often referred to as the power trust. It was these like vertically integrated power companies like that were run by people like Samuel Insull and these sort of robber baron type capitalists who controlled these systems purely for their own profit and totally corrupt and graft and all this stuff. And so that created this movement for publicly owned electricity, public power. And it was grounded in this idea that the rivers were public, the river systems were like a commons that should be owned by the public and should be harnessed for public good and not just for this sort of private form of profiteering, using the electricity system for profiteering. And, it was really like an inspiring vision that they had to deliver electricity to masses of poor people that didn't have it. In 1934, 10% of farms had electricity in the United States. By 1950, it was up to above 90%. And so the project was private capital. If they control electricity, they won't find it profitable to deliver this electricity to these masses. We need a more public approach. And to me, that kind of, we really need to, we've been subjected to a neoliberal kind of deregulation of the electricity system, where it's now all run on private markets and spot markets, and the price of natural gas sort of shapes the spot market for electricity. And it's all very marketized, very in the control of private generators. And we need to kind of revive this history that actually we can build more public and democratic forms of control. And that fundamentally the climate crisis is a public crisis that really we can't trust the private sector to solve. So an analogy I've been thinking about lately is, in the 19th century, you had a kind of public health crisis of waterborne disease because there weren't investments in modern sewage treatment and water delivery systems. And of course, the solution to that crisis was not just to let the market figure it out and maybe create like an excrement tax for individuals to pay for their own contribution of waste to the system. No, they realized they had to build like public infrastructure and public investment to solve this public crisis in the form of sewage treatment plants, water delivery systems, and all the rest of it. Matthew brought up a locally run electricity, and I just one of the things I've been arguing for is we need to think bigger about electricity, to think about what I've called in another article called In Defense of the Tennessee Valley Authority, big public power. We actually there's a lot of sort of localism in the environmental and climate movement that thinks we're just going to have small scale solar co-ops and microgrids that will solve the problem, but we actually need big, large scale energy. And he's right that renewables, actually, technologically speaking, can bring a lot of instability to the grid. So you actually need, even if you want all renewables, which we could argue about, and in fact, industrial unions are quite much more sort of flexible about the technology that we would integrate. But even if you wanted a lot of renewables, you're going to need socialized kind of planning to be able to link up renewables from different parts of regions to connect them in ways with batteries, as you pointed out, that could actually deliver a stable grid, which if our climate politics can't deliver a stable grid, it's going to lead to all this right-wing backlash. And again, this right-wing narrative that the liberal environmentalists want to destroy your way of life and that kind of stuff. Last thing, lithium, it's crucial. But I think instead of, there's a lot of kind of climate justice focus that just talks about all the destruction from lithium mining that's happening right now in like Chile, and I think that's important to bring up, but I think we should also bring up about building kind of counter power against the Elon Musks of the world that just want to coup and use imperialism to make sure capital has control over these lithium supplies globally. We should think about, there's actually emergent left-wing movements in places like Latin America where governments and states could actually assert more public control and also empower unions in those sectors to assert more worker control over lithium supply. And in fact, just recently, the leftist government of Mexico announced they're nationalizing their lithium, and Indonesia just recently announced that they should set up something like an OPEC kind of a sort of series of states that assert more sovereignty over their lithium supplies. These are things we should think more about, how building sort of more left power over these supply chains, as opposed to just saying, you know, any kind of extractivism is necessarily bad. We want to build up working class power over these systems, which I think Matthew brought up a lot of talk about, how the working class is this social force that has this unique power to build, and particularly power to build over industrial production systems like mines, exactly. So Finbar, or Finn, that was just really kind overview of the contributions of the book. So thank you. And I really appreciate you were able to reframe a lot of the arguments in fresh and really compelling ways. So thanks so much. One thing I have realized since I wrote the book is I do narrowly focus for 2 chapters on electricity and electricity workers. And I do still think that we should think about these workers are going to be at the core of a socialist type of strategy. But since I've written the book, I've realized that we could probably think a little more broadly about what are often referred to as the building trades unions, the construction unions, because, and unfortunately, those unions are, you know, as I think someone pointed out, quite conservative and quite not great, not particularly on the left-wing side of things in many cases. In fact, many of these building trades unions have butted heads with environmentalists when environmentalists are often doing campaigns and direct action tactics that are about blocking pipelines or blocking power plants or blocking coal trains or whatever, Extinction Rebellion, blocking traffic. So the building trades really butt heads with that style of environmentalism that's about blocking stuff. But what's clear to me is that if we want to solve climate change, we're going to have to build a whole lot of stuff as well. Like, we're going to have to build a new energy system, build new public transit, new green housing. And I think this politics, like the Green New Deal politics of building new public infrastructure, actually has much more selling power to these building trades unions, where they wouldn't have to think hard about getting on board with this more building oriented politics. And in fact, that's actually what we need. You know, I think Corbyn's Labour Party called for a green industrial revolution. Like, that's what we actually need, a massive industrial revolution. And that would put workers that do building at the center of it, and they could be a real core part of it. The climate movement tends to kind of, because these unions are problematic and conservative, they tend to just sort of say we don't want to focus on them at all and think we can win transformative climate action with kind of what I would call low carbon unions, like teachers and nurses, which are more sort of naturally allied with climate activism and more professional class left-wing politics. But I think that we can do a third industrial revolution, a green industrial revolution, without these industrial workers is just, it's delusional in my humble opinion. Okay, so Finn had 2 questions. I'm not a chemist. So I have, one of the chapters of the book is about the fertilizer industry. So I have some good knowledge there. I will point out that there's been huge breakthroughs in green steel production, where I think someone in the chat was pointing out, it's a process that doesn't need to rely on coal, which it relies on right now for the coking process. And interestingly, to go back to Matthew's issue of control, these green steel innovations are being developed by state-owned enterprises in Sweden, actually. So kind of, again, different forms of public control where they're able to develop investments that were more about this more public good-oriented crisis we're facing, as opposed to some narrow profit-based motive. So cement, something I know they're working on it, and there are options, but you're right, there's a fundamental part of the production process that creates CO2 as a byproduct. But I think there again are options. The problem with all these options is they're not particularly cost effective or profitable to investors. So that's the key issue we face. We need a big sort of public build out of this stuff because capital isn't going to do it. Nitrogen is, there's an easy source of hydrogen, which is water. You can use electrolysis of water. People have known about this for 100 years. It's just more costly. It's actually more energy intensive. But there's a lot of excitement, again, on green hydrogen, which would feed right into a green ammonia or nitrogen production system. And again, green hydrogen, green ammonia, just not particularly competitive with fossil fuel-based ammonia, natural gas-based ammonia, coal-based ammonia. So again, there's this need to kind of build up these sectors through a different logic of control that isn't just about profit and market competition. It has to be about this more dealing with, if it really is a planetary emergency, we have to deploy technology on the basis of wider criteria than simply private profitability. DSA, I think, I was actually just, and again, Democratic Socialists of America, I was actually just traveling in Europe to talk about the book with lots of different groups. And I was sort of stunned to realize that like Democratic Socialists of America right now have the most members of any socialist organization since the 1940s in the United States. But I was also kind of stunned to realize that if I recall, I think like left parties in Europe, even like Die Linke in Germany, are about 40,000 members. So we have more members than some of these left parties. But DSA is an incredibly ecumenical and what's called a multi-tendency organization. So it has anarchist, it has Stalinist, it has Trotskyist, it has all these different flavors of socialist. And so that is both a strength, it's able to build a mass, although it's still quite not, it's still sort of concentrated amongst these, what are often called downwardly mobile, college-educated millennials type of sort of precarious professional class type people. But I think the multi-tendency is a strength, but it also a weakness in terms of there's not a lot of focused party-like discipline or program that's really organizing everyone on a similar set of political traditions and principles, really. And I would say, unfortunately, for my part, that the eco-socialist wing of DSA is almost entirely run by what are often referred to as like degrowth socialists, who are quite anti-industrial and anti-technology, and again, sort of are constantly talking about overconsumption, focusing on consumption, are constantly doing this, what I call in the book, a politics of less. And it's problematic. I was just in Denmark, where I got a sense that the sort of party of this kind of eco-socialism is something called the Red-Green Alliance. But I learned that this this party is also very concentrated amongst kind of middle upper class professionals in the city of Copenhagen, and they're very much like not in touch in connecting with the broader working class, particularly industrial workers. And there was just recently an article about the recent Danish elections in Jacobin, where they show that a lot of the industrial workers in the wind energy in Denmark are not going to the Red-Green Alliance, they're going to the right. And so like many of the sort of old industrial workers across Europe and the United States, a lot of them are shifting rightward, whereas the center-left parties are shifting more towards these affluent, highly educated constituencies. And that can be more radical type of socialist people, but it can also be quite liberal, centrist types of people that are coalescing around these old parties of the working class that are now becoming like parties of affluent, educated people. And so, you know, I tried to write some, way back in 2019, I tried to write some sort of pieces in the DSA journal that were quite critical of this degrowth tendency. And I just got slammed by it, and no one paid much attention to me. And so I don't feel like I've won over many of the comrades in DSA towards this different vision of socialism and climate politics, but there are a few people here and there. And the people that do have responded positively to the book in DSA are invariably people in the trade union movement, people who are doing what is often referred to as a rank and file strategy, which DSA has tried to get people to become trade union activists, to take jobs in strategic sectors. And particularly, they did a big campaign around getting jobs as teachers, to try to build a more democratic fighting union movement in the teachers' unions. There's a lot of militancy in the teachers' unions, but there's also a lot of people that have taken jobs in the building trades, and particularly electricity, and working for some of these very unions that I'm talking about, like the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers, and are trying to kind of build a more radical socialist caucus or fighting tradition in these unions. And as Fenn pointed out, you don't do that by going in and preaching about climate politics. You try to sort of understand where workers are struggling in the workplace, what are their immediate workplace concerns, and try to build up a fighting, struggling union movement from those really immediate workplace concerns, and then build power outward from that kind of basis. Oh boy. So I've talked for a while. I know Rob, I think Rob was next. Rob brings up a lot of thorny, difficult points. Capitalism is resilient, and I actually agree. I could foresee a green capitalism that deals with the climate crisis to some degree. I have skepticism that it can fully deal with it, because again, I think a lot of what we need to do to fully solve it are not profitable to capital. So my sense is that capitalism might develop a kind of green capitalist energy sector that's able to maybe keep us to 2.5 or 3 degrees. But as Rob points out, that's going to be a barbaric world of horrific ramifications for most people, but it might reproduce kind of the capital relation in a very unstable way. And I do think keeping us to, people used to hope for 1.5 degrees, and I'm still hopeful we can reach that. But even in that 1.5 to 2 degree, I think we're going to have some kind of large scale social commitment to public investment that is not purely on the grounds of profitability. And so both those worlds are not great, actually, because we're only at 1.2 degrees and we already see just the dramatic, horrific implications. I do agree with Rob that it's hard to imagine a socialist revolution on the time scale that we need to solve climate change. And a lot of people have made this argument, Christian Parenti being a left-wing thinker so we actually need to we need to acknowledge that the left and the working class is quite defeated. It's undergone decades of being crushed by capital, and that's what we call the Adolf Reed, the socialist in the US, he has a great definition of neoliberalism since 1980. It's essentially capitalism without a working class opposition. So we have to be serious that we have a lot of work to do to rebuild a working class opposition, and it's not going to be easy. It's going to take time. And if you will indulge me, Rob's points brought up a great quote that I've used in one of my writings that I found just after the passing of the legendary socialist Leo Panitch. And this is from Leo, where he says, quote, "The tenor of the moment is to say we've only got 5 or 10 years left because of the depth of the climate emergency. That kind of slogan was designed to get people to see how serious things are. But as a political strategy, it is a dead end. We can't think in those terms, no matter how desperate the climate situation. We have to be able to think in terms of 10, 15, or 20 years. There is fundamental class and organizational rebuilding to be done. It takes time." And I think we have to be sober and serious that it will take time to rebuild a fighting working class movement. But that's really, in my view, like our only hope to ushering in the kind of massive transformations that we need. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, their famous 2018 report, said we need to see rapid and far-reaching changes in all aspects of society. I mean, the scientists actually are really saying we need a kind of revolution of sorts. But we have to, if we're going to rebuild that movement, we have to start from, I think a little humbler goals than a, full-on abolition of capitalism. So one thing in the book I argue is that rather than just imagining we're going to revolutionize all of society, we should think about how can we change this one sector, right? Electricity. And that's at the core of decarbonization. If we can build up working class power and electricity, we can develop what I refer to, it's sort of, I'm making a joke, socialism in one sector. So we build up public socialized worker control in that sector to stave off the worst effects of climate change. But that can build up sort of horizons of working class power, that if we could take public ownership of electricity, what about in the United States, what about public healthcare? What about more public housing? So to widen the sort of expectations and sort of confidence of the working class by building power in this one sector. But we have to maybe have more realistic and small scale aspirations to start, because we are coming from this defeat of neoliberalism over many decades. So I think I covered everything. I apologies if I didn't hit a lot of the core issues.
Matt, that's really, really brilliant. Thank you so much. Ian's still got, if you've got time, Matt, I mean, we quite often run these meetings for a couple of hours. We got about maybe 25 minutes or so left. Ian's got his hand up. Actually, I can see the name Ian twice on my screen, and one of those Ians has got his hand up. So I'm inviting Ian to come in with a question, and there is time if other comrades want to say anything to respond to what Matt's just said, or what other comrades in the room have just said. Over to you, Ian.
Thanks. Both Ians are actually me. I've just put my phone back on so that I can ask this question in this way, because my camera's not working on my computer these last few days. And I promise not to be as long as last time. It's funny, Matt said he didn't have much to say back to me apart from agreeing at the start of your answers, which is maybe one of the best answers sessions I've ever seen. Very, very comprehensive. But your last wee bit actually was, if I could say so, quite related to the questions of timescale that I was asking about. I suppose it's a follow-up to what you've just said, though I was thinking of it before. A couple of quick questions, really. One is, in terms of convincing people who, I have to point out, unlike me, don't see climate change as an immediate problem. There is also the related question of peak oil, that even if the oil, and I don't think it does, of course, was beneficial or had made no impact on the climate, it is a finite resource. That's the actual definition of renewables, is that they're different from that. And it will run out. And also before it actually runs out, it gets more and more difficult to to acquire more and more expensive. That means under the perverse incentives of capitalism, more and more profitable for the producers at the very top of that production chain, while distorting the economy for everybody else, even other sectors of business and of course the working people. And that's sort of what's playing out now. So even for people who are either unconvinced or feel themselves unaffected by climate change, I wonder if a campaign against peak oil and in favour of renewables from that perspective, as well as the perspective of creating jobs, is one to go down. I must say the Danish example of even people working in windmills voting for the far right who are probably anti-environmental is very worrying. Just a very quick side note on the Red Green Alliance I briefly knew, might still be Facebook friends with. Their former, one of their former leaders, when we were both youth at a Fourth International Youth Camp 10 or 15 years ago that I heard about through Respect when the Fourth International were involved in that. I was disappointed a few years after that to see that her and presumably the whole Red Green Alliance had voted with a heavy heart, they said, for the war in Libya because they were backing social democratic government at the time, which supported that war. So it feeds into this kind of flabbiness, even of some of the radical left that I was complaining about before. Perhaps that's connected, not directly, but in terms of their overall approach to why they're struggling to hold on to working class votes. My final question was about climate mitigations, and even, which is often poo-pooed in the environmental movement, attempts to cool the earth, like 1.5. I'm glad you're still hopeful we can reach it. I'm not so sure. I also think even 1.5 is still pretty disastrous when you see the consequences of it, even if we don't go any further than that, which we might. As you say, we're on 1.3 now and it's pretty bad. So that's sometimes dismissed by environmentalists, and you can see why they don't want to take off the pressure from that panic quote about impressing on people the seriousness of the situation. And we say, you can just refreeze the Arctic later on. Sure, that can be an argument for inaction, but under a socialist plan, perhaps we should be looking at these technologies of refreezing the Arctic. We should certainly be looking at things like electric planes. We shouldn't be poo-pooing that. It might not be possible in the immediate scale, but we shouldn't be poo-pooing innovation. That we should be for all these kind of things, but say they should be under workers' control rather than under the control of a few capitalists. And I think the counterposing of that to the narrative of it's all about reducing consumption has been quite disastrous for the environmental movement. And I think the job of socialists, in a way, I don't want to sound too corny, but it is to inject hope into this debate, that the same things that would make life better rather than worse for ordinary people can also be good for the environment, rather than the kind of zero-sum game that's sometimes assumed in the mainstream debate about it. All right, I may have forgotten something, but I think I've had a good bite of the cherry now. So thanks.
Okay, thank you, Ian. The Byrne brothers have got their hands up. One of you has. Please come in.
Yes, I just want to take up Matt's point when he said he felt that we should be concentrating on electricity. I mean, in Britain at the moment, we have a situation of a strike wave going on, covering the railways, teachers, the health service, etc. And if you like, that strike wave is not just about the cost of living and restoring, if you like, the balance of the pay packet, which has declined in many cases by 20% over the last 10 years. One of the things that stands out in all the strikes and all the unions, presentations of the strike is the they don't use the word corrupt, but it amounts to corrupt management of these industries, whether it's the National Health Service, whether it's the railways, etc. And the fact they don't raise the point of, if you like, having democratic workers' control or nationalisation, but that is, if you like, the real thing that comes out, that the industries that are on strike, there is absolute corruption, there's massive pay rises for the bosses, and the workers are treated like rubbish. And I think that then leads to the whole question of who controls these industries and what is their accountability to society. So I think as far as, if you like, movements for workers' control and workers' involvement in the running of industries, that in itself develops out of the very nature of the situation that we're in at the present time.
Right, thanks very much. That was John, wasn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you, John. No one else has got their hand up. I'm going to throw in one more question and then hand things back to Matt. Now, the simple version of my question is, why are capitalists so committed to fossil fuels? But there's also, and this is the real part of the question, there's an attempt at an answer from me, and I'd like to sort of try it out on you, Matt, because I think you've got more expertise than me in this. That Marx talked about the tendency of the rate of profit to fall, particularly in industries where the proportion of investment in human labor becomes very, very small, because Marx pointed out that it's human labor that produces profit. The other costs in industry are not susceptible to the creation of profit. Now, if we are taking new industries like wind farms and solar panels and so on, once the equipment is installed, there's almost no human labor involved. And I think capitalists probably see this as the investment cost being too expensive. But in Marx's terms, is it not, in fact, that you can't derive sufficient profit from it to make it worthwhile? So, the very technology that is required to really save the planet is not seen by capitalists as worthwhile investing in, and they'd rather continue with this very old-fashioned sort of extraction of these filthy fuels. That's the question. I see Matthew has his hand up. Matt Huber, I'm asking now. How much time do you think you need for the questions that have already been asked?
Not too much. I think I could cover them in 5-10 minutes. So
we're gonna Matthew, I'm asking you now if you can make this one brief, and this will be the last question of the meeting, and then we'll go over Matt Huber to sum up. Okay, Matthew, your second bite of the cherry.
I was more just trying to respond to some of the stuff you say, because I actually work for an electricity company, so I can say, actually, of course, there isn't. I mean, there is actually a fair amount of work in wind farms. The permanent labour workforce and people work on them. I was even in my company. Was a couple of people killed actually doing maintenance on wind farms. It's not without dangers. So the other thing is that the utilities are very political and highly regulated. And very much controlled by the state, in fact. So it's actually, you should look at utilities really as these sort of state licensed and controlled operations, rather than simply capitalist. I mean, the actual management get really quite annoyed about this, the nature of regulation that they've got. But politically, they can't avoid it. So it's actually controlled very heavily by the state. You've got, under the current conditions, what's been happening, of course, is that because of the squeeze on fossil fuel generation, of course, is what's happened now is that renewables have been making huge amounts of money because the price of electricity, because of the mechanism they use is this thing called marginal pricing, which is actually devised by the British, which says basically what you bid in for each half an hour, and the highest bid accepted is then paid to everybody. And what that means is that at the moment what happens is that all the gas power stations are basically setting the price, and they're setting the price at £300 odd, £400 in some cases a megawatt, and your cost to generate for a wind farm is something like 20 quid a megawatt. So basically, you need a very big wheelbarrow to cart away all the money you're making, which is why I've just shoved in this big windfall tax on renewables and in fact nuclear, because the nuclear cost to generate is for about 50 quid. So it's basically what we're having is a situation of regulation, and at the same time, if you look at what's happened on the wire companies, actually the wire companies in the last 5 years in this country, because of the way that the regulations were set out was wrong, and that their miscalculation on interest rates, it meant that wire companies made a huge amount of money, basically because the regulations said they could, and they did. And they've been trying to readjust it. So actually, it's very much more political than purely just sort of saying, well, it's a capitalist operation. It's based on some kind of market, operation, all that sort of stuff. Actually, it's a state-controlled franchise, if you like, and these companies are allowed to make money on the basis that it's set out by the state.
Okay, thank you, Matt, and thank you for keeping that brief. Over to Matt Huber.
All right. So first, Ian, the first thing you brought up is how to convince people that are not already converted to the seriousness of climate change, and that's sort of the big conundrum, because like I said, when you're dealing with a population like in the United States where 47% think climate change won't affect them personally, or whatever it was, 53, or it's really going to take it's hard to convince people that this is important, which is why I think if we're able to ground it in the more obvious things that working people do care about, like housing and energy cost and cost of living, then we're going to have it's not going to take much convincing, because people will I drew from one of the architects of the Green New Deal that said people aren't going to have to, it's not complicated. They'll just say that Green New Deal thing that improved my life. I like that, right? But again, being able to convince people means you got to be able to deliver those types of working class improvements. And that's, I think, where we're really stuck, because we don't quite have the organized power to deliver those types of things. The peak oil thing, I should say, I'm an oil scholar. My first book was about oil, and I wrote my dissertation during the peak oil of the sort of, I would call it the peak oil panic of the aughts. And in my view, from studying this after a while, that the peak oil tends to be overdone. I mean, we definitely saw, with all the concern about peak oil in the aughts, was just drowned out by a flood of new oil that was found via fracking, and particularly other types of offshore oil. And so one of the challenges we face if we're concerned about climate change is that capital's proven itself pretty good at getting oil when the price gets high. It gives them all the incentive they need to develop new reserves. So the real problem we face is there's just too much oil still left on the planet, that if we burn it, it's going to, forget about 1.5, it's going to shoot us to 3-4 degrees. So that said, you're right, it is finite, and there might be a concern of peak oil at some point. But you look at the history of the oil industry, and the concern that most people around it have is more about overproduction and glut and overcapacity. And they, OPEC and other arrangements are attempts to kind of prevent the production of oil to keep prices high. But what I do think is, as you said, we can call it organize around peak oil or organize around getting off fossil fuels for climate crisis reasons. What we need is a massive energy transition. So making that case, can also, I think we can make the case that oil and gas in particular are incredibly volatile in their prices, and they go through these booms and busts, and that volatility is really disruptive to people's lives. So that's one argument for a transition to a more, again, more stable, perhaps publicly provisioned energy system that could actually give working class people not only cheap energy, but stable energy. I totally agree with Ian that we need to be more flexible or more open-minded about various options we have for climate mitigation. Too often the environmental left, everything that's talked about as a new technology that might help things is considered a techno fix that supposedly, you know, keeps capitalist social relations intact and doesn't change anything. But the argument I've been trying to make lately is that to develop some of these technologies, we need to fundamentally change the social relations of investment, and as everyone keeps bringing up, the control over investment, and it's only by changing those social relations will a lot of these technologies be developed, because again, they're not particularly profitable. So one you brought up is direct air capture, where we could start drawing down the carbon that's already in the atmosphere, which we actually are going to need to do to some degree, because there's already so much up there. And thinkers like Holly Jean Buck, who wrote a book called After Geoengineering, and another great new book called Ending Fossil Fuels, has really innovative ideas to think about why couldn't we have carbon removal be sort of a public utility, like, again, similar to like sewage treatment. Like, we need public workforces to kind of draw down this carbon from the atmosphere. And she points out that a lot of the skills to do that work already exist in the oil and gas industry. So you could employ formerly oil and gas workers to do this work of injecting carbon down. You actually take it from the atmosphere, you have to inject it underneath the earth in these well depositories where it will supposedly, hopefully, never come back up. And so that work could be done under public ownership, employ oil and gas workers, and we should be open to that and not call it just techno fix or whatever. Okay, so I guess it's John Byrne. Brings up a really incredible and important point about an ongoing strike wave. There's now renewed potential for a rail strike in the United States, which I think could really create a real crisis for political elites. And the threat of a strike earlier this fall led Joe Biden to basically pull all-nighters trying to prevent the strike. So it really shows the power that workers that have. When they even threat to go on strike, they get the halls of power start moving to try to prevent it. And I was just in the UK in early November, and I was very excited to learn about this kind of webs of solidarity that are forming across sectors between teachers and nurses and other types of workers, rail workers. So that's super exciting. And if in my book I'm very narrow about like electricity sector or even building trades, I think at a very basic level, what we need is to revive militant working class struggle. And if we can do that in teachers unions or rail unions or nurses unions, all to the better. But Jay McAlevy's book has this great line from a trade union leader that the strike weapon is like a muscle that if you don't use it, it atrophies or it just becomes unusable. And so, you know, I'm pretty sure it's similar in the UK, but the United States, basically after 1980, the level of strike activity just fell off a cliff. And so workers have forgotten that they have this power, and that when they go on strike, they can create tremendous crises that force elites to answer to the set of demands. You know, when the West Virginia teachers went on strike, they won their demands in 2 weeks. Whereas if they wanted to like lobby the legislature and get the right people elected, it would have taken them decades to do it. They did it in 2 weeks, and they did it in a right-wing state with Republican legislature, and they did it via the power that the workers have. But I agree that if the strike wave starts to politicize these more issues of control of these industries, and again, calling for more working class control over investment, that's the direction we want to really go in, particularly for climate. Oh, okay. So Ed, really provocative questions. I'm going to put into the chat a couple articles by a really great scholar in geography, actually, my field, called Brett Christophers. And this, particularly this first article that's called Fossilized Capital, he makes a strong argument that from his analysis, you know, what you hear often in the climate space is that renewables are so cheap. So therefore, it's almost like now we have this renewed faith that the market will deliver the transition because renewables are so cheap. But he argues that we should not confuse the price of a commodity with its profitability, and that particularly in his analysis, that renewables have not proven profitable for investors on a big scale, and that fossil fuels are profitable, and that companies are still very willing to invest in fossil fuel production because they know they will make profits. I do think what Matthew was bringing up about the way in which electricity markets are structured, and the second article that by Christopher is called Bringing Renewables to Market, gets into this very deregulated, marketized spot market way in which we set up electricity markets, where marginal pricing schemes allow it for gas to set the price. But what happens when that system is in work, renewable generators who are able to generate almost zero cost or negative cost energy make these windfall profits. So there is something interesting where once the renewables are set up, they can kind of game the market to create kind of these profits for them. But there is still very clearly not the level of investment that we need. And actually, Martin Wolf just had a Financial Times piece where he says, yes, the market can deliver us the energy transition, but it's clearly not happening fast enough. If you look, investment in renewables is just flatlined in the last 3 years. It's not growing like we want it to see it grow. I would also point out to Ed, you're probably aware of this classic book by Andreas Malm called Fossil Capital, which tries to argue why capital really chose coal in the early days of the Industrial Revolution, when they had a much cheaper form of energy, water power, that was freely available. And why did they choose this coal stuff, which they had to pay for as a commodity? And what he comes down to is that essentially, when you try to get capitalists to use water power, they realize it's this, what he called a flow-based resource. It's almost like a commons that the capitalists had to figure out how to share, coordinate access to the water power in sort of a collective way. And that was inimical to the social relations of private property and capitalism. So they said, we'd much rather just have private steam engines where we have our own coal and we can control it. And also, by the way, we can locate these steam engines in the cities where there's a lot of labor power, a lot of surplus populations where you can easily procure workers, whereas the water power, you had to go to the countryside and the workers would have a lot of power out there because there weren't a lot of them. So, but he makes some analogies to the fact that renewables are also a flow-based or kind of commons-based resource. And he talks about this attempt by capitalists to kind of set up a big solar farm in the Moroccan desert that was going to supposedly like channel all this energy to Europe, this kind of neo-colonial thing. But again, the capitalists couldn't figure out how to share this kind of commons of the sunshine, and this sort of free, abundant energy source was inimical to capitalist property relations. That's just a breathtakingly brilliant book if you haven't checked it out. The last thing, I guess I'm running out of time. I think I'll just end it there. And again, thank you all for such an engaging couple hours.
Well, thank you, Matt, for an engaging couple of hours. I think, you know, your delivery of this talk has been really spot on from the point of view of the interests and the needs of the comrades here, and your expertise in this field has shined through all the way through the meeting. So we're very grateful to you for being involved, and invite you, please, to be involved in more of our meetings, even if we're not talking about this particular topic, because you've obviously got a lot to contribute to the Marxist movement in general. So thanks again, Matt, and thanks all the comrades who've participated. And I'm going to hand over to Roger now to probably say a few words about next week's meeting.
Yes, thank you. First of all, I'd like to add my thanks to Matt. I thought that was really very, very interesting. I felt inhibited from contributing to the discussion because other comrades understand the issues a lot better than I do, but I've learned a huge amount from listening to the discussion, and I do think it also it underlines the fact that it's a myth put about by some environmentalists that Marxism takes no account of environmental issues. Or on the contrary, Marx and Engels were perhaps among the first to explain them and put them in context. I have one of my favorite quotes from Engels is when he says, "The animal merely uses external nature and brings about changes in it simply by his presence. Man, by his changes, makes it serves his end, masters it." But he says, "We by no means rule over nature like a conqueror over a foreign people, like someone standing over nature, but that we, with flesh, blood, and brain, belong to nature and exist in its midst." And then he ends up with a very apposite point. He says, "Let's not flatter ourselves overmuch on account of our human conquest over nature, for each such conquest takes its revenge on us." And I think, well, we know very well what he meant. But the question is that, you know, Matt ended by talking about the rise in the strike movement in Britain and the prospect of the rail strike in USA and so on. There is a worldwide upsurge in struggle today and in strikes. And obviously, it will take a revolution in society to resolve these problems, but a socialist revolution will also mean a revolution in technology. And right, that links up with our next meeting. I just, you know, I'd also repeat Ed's invitation to Matt to participate in future meetings. We meet every week. The next meeting is, if comrades remember, we have an occasional series on the history of the workers' international movement, and the next in that series is next week on the birth of the Communist International. So I hope, well, I welcome everybody, invite everybody to participate. See you next week, comrades.
Thanks very much, everybody. Thank you, Roger, and thanks for a great meeting, and see you next week. Bye.